For a long time, I believed that holding cash was the responsible option. It felt stable, predictable, quiet. Nothing moved, nothing fluctuated, nothing surprised me. And that was exactly the problem. Doing nothing with money feels safe because nothing appears to be happening. There are no charts to watch, no red numbers, no sudden drops, just balance, just stillness. But stillness in finance is not the same as safety. It is simply movement you cannot see. Most people associate risk with volatility, with sudden losses, with sharp declines that trigger panic. But the most common financial risk is slower than that. It doesn't shock, it erodes, quietly. Holding cash feels like opting out of danger, but in reality, it is opting into a different kind of exposure. One that doesn't announce itself. One that doesn't come with headlines. While I was holding cash, prices were still moving. The cost of living did not pause. Rent did not wait. Assets did not stop repricing themselves. My money stayed the same. Everything else did not. This is the first illusion of safety. We confuse stability of numbers with stability of value. A number that doesn't change can still lose meaning. It can still buy less. It can still fall behind the world around it. And because this process is gradual, it rarely feels urgent. Urgency requires contrast. Inflation works without it. Every year, a little less. Every decision, slightly delayed. Every opportunity just out of reach. The danger is not dramatic, which is why it's ignored. People often say they are waiting for a better time while holding cash. But cash is not a neutral waiting room. It is a position. It has characteristics. It has consequences. It has a risk profile. It just doesn't look like one. When you hold cash, you are making a bet. Not a bet that markets will go up, but a bet that they will not move enough to justify participation. You are betting that staying still will protect purchasing power. You are betting that optionality will outweigh erosion. You are betting that time will be kind. Sometimes it is. Often it isn't. The problem is not that cash is always wrong. The problem is that it is often misunderstood. Cash is a tool, but many people treat it as a refuge. Refuges are emotional. Tools are functional. And when emotion enters financial decisions, clarity leaves. I remember how reassuring it felt to see the same balance month after month. It felt like control. It felt like discipline, but control is not the same as progress. Progress requires friction, exposure, the willingness to accept that numbers will move before they move in your favor. Cash removes friction, which is why it feels calm. But calm can be expensive. There is a reason people feel more anxious watching investments than watching cash. Investments demand attention. They reflect uncertainty back at you. They force you to confront time. Cash lets you forget. And forgetting feels like peace, until you realize that forgetting does not stop the clock. One of the most common mistakes in personal finance is evaluating decisions in isolation. People ask, is this risky? But they forget to ask, compared to what? Risk is always relative. It only makes sense in comparison. Compared to market volatility, cash feels safe. Compared to inflation and opportunity cost, it does not. When you hold cash for long periods, you're exposed to a silent trade. You trade visible risk for invisible loss. Visible risk scares people. Invisible loss does not. Which is why so many intelligent, cautious individuals end up underperforming. Not because they lack knowledge, but because they overvalue comfort. Comfort has a return. It just isn't financial. It returns peace of mind, short-term reassurance, the ability to sleep without checking prices. But over time, comfort compounds into something else. Distance. Distance from growth. Distance from learning. distance from adaptation. Markets reward those who adapt. Cash delays adaptation. It postpones the emotional education that investing provides, the experience of seeing fluctuations and surviving them, the realization that volatility is uncomfortable but not fatal. By staying in cash, you avoid those lessons, which means when you finally step into risk, it feels overwhelming. Late exposure is harder than early exposure because the stakes feel higher, because time feels scarcer. This is why many people remain in cash far longer than they intended. They are not waiting for returns. They are waiting for confidence. But confidence rarely arrives before exposure. It usually arrives after. Another illusion of cash is flexibility. People say they want liquidity, optionality, the ability to act quickly. But optionality only matters if it is used. Most people who hold cash waiting for opportunity do not deploy it decisively. When opportunity arrives, fear arrives with it, because opportunity and uncertainty are inseparable. So, the option remains unused, and time passes again. Liquidity is valuable, but unused liquidity is just deferred indecision. There is also a narrative element to cash that people rarely examine. Holding cash feels prudent. It feels defensible. You can explain it easily. I didn't want to risk it. I was being careful. I was waiting for clarity. These explanations sound reasonable. They attract little criticism. Few people are judged harshly for not acting, but markets are indifferent to social approval. They do not reward defensibility. They reward alignment with time. This is why cash often dominates during periods of uncertainty. Not because it is optimal, but because it is emotionally acceptable. In uncertain environments, caution feels virtuous. Action feels reckless. Yet uncertainty is not an exception in markets. It is the default. If you wait for uncertainty to disappear, you are waiting for something that has never existed. This does not mean that cash has no role. It does. Cash is useful for stability, for emergencies, for known short-term needs. The mistake is extending that logic indefinitely, turning a short-term tool into a long-term strategy. Short-term safety does not scale. Long-term outcomes require participation. Participation means accepting that numbers will change, that drawdowns will happen, that discomfort is part of the process. Cash removes discomfort, but it also removes momentum. Momentum is not about speed. It is about direction. And cash, by design, has no direction. It simply sits. Over time, sitting becomes falling behind. The most dangerous part of this dynamic is how reasonable it feels. There is no obvious failure point, no moment when holding cash clearly breaks. Instead, there is a gradual divergence between where you are and where you could have been. That gap is rarely felt day to day. It is felt in hindsight, when years have passed, when opportunities are no longer comparable, when starting now requires more capital, more risk, more urgency. By then, the cost of doing nothing becomes visible. But it is no longer reversible. This is why personal finance is not about maximizing returns. It is about minimizing regret. Regret does not come from volatility. It comes from missed participation, from realizing that fear made decisions quietly over long periods of time. The alternative to cash dominance is not recklessness. It is structure. Structure allows you to engage with risk without making it dramatic. It allows you to define boundaries, time horizons, rules that do not change with emotion. Structure transforms risk from a threat into a process. Cash, when used without structure, becomes avoidance. It feels neutral, but it is not. It is a choice with consequences that compound silently. Once you see that, holding cash stops feeling automatically safe. It starts feeling conditional. Safe for what? Safe for how long? Safe compared to which alternative? Those questions matter more than the balance itself. The market does not punish cash immediately. It simply moves forward without it. And over time, that movement becomes the difference between stability and stagnation. This is not an argument against cash. It is an argument against unexamined safety. Because safety that ignores time is not safety. It is delay, and delay has a cost. One final thought often goes unnoticed. Many people believe they will move out of cash when they feel ready. But readiness is not a feeling that appears spontaneously. It is built through repeated exposure to uncertainty. If exposure never happens, readiness never arrives. Cash can buy time, but it cannot teach comfort with risk. Only experience can do that. This is not financial advice. It is a way of thinking about money, exposure, and the quiet risks that come from doing nothing. There is also a subtle psychological reward that comes from holding cash that rarely gets discussed. It allows you to postpone accountability. As long as you haven't acted, results cannot judge you. There is no feedback loop, no evidence that a choice was right or wrong. That absence of feedback feels protective. But it also freezes growth. Feedback is how people improve decisions. Without it, intuition never sharpens. You remain stuck with the same fears, the same assumptions, the same mental shortcuts. Markets are one of the few environments that provide honest feedback over time. Not immediate, not gentle, but consistent. Cash delays that conversation. Another overlooked aspect is how narratives shift when you stay inactive. At first, holding cash is framed as prudence. Later, it becomes justification. Then it becomes identity. I'm a conservative investor. I don't like risk. I prefer to stay liquid. These statements sound like preferences, but often they are post-rationalizations. Ways to make inaction feel intentional. Once inaction becomes identity, changing course becomes harder. Because now you are not just changing a position, you are challenging a self-image. That is why long periods in cash can feel comfortable, yet confining. Safe, but narrow. Predictable, but limiting. The longer you stay there, the more effort it takes to leave. This is why the real danger of doing nothing is not financial loss. It is rigidity. Rigidity in thinking, rigidity in behavior, rigidity in response to change. And in a world that constantly reprices risk, rigidity is expensive. The goal of personal finance is not to eliminate discomfort. It is to channel it productively, to accept manageable uncertainty in exchange for adaptability. Cash eliminates uncertainty, but it also eliminates adaptation. Over long horizons, adaptation matters more than protection, because no financial environment stays static. What was safe yesterday can become insufficient tomorrow. Safety that does not evolve eventually breaks. Understanding this does not force action. It invites examination. It asks you to look at your decisions not as moral choices, but as trade-offs. Every trade-off has a cost. Some are immediate, others are deferred. Cash specializes in deferring cost, which is why it feels benign. Until time collects, safety that does not evolve eventually breaks. Understanding this does not force action. It invites examination. It asks you to look at your decisions not as moral choices, but as trade-offs. Every trade-off has a cost. Some are immediate, others are deferred. Cash specializes in deferring cost, which is why it feels benign. Until time collects. Most financial decisions aren't about information. They're about how you think. If this perspective resonates, you can subscribe to the channel for future videos.